On behalf of the Planning Commission, I'd like to welcome you to this one of many scheduled events to roll out and introduce the draft land use regulations, and most importantly, to hear your feedback. My name is Liz McLaughlin. I'm the chair of the Planning Commission. And as you know, the Planning Commission is made up of residents of the town of Brattleboro, and we're appointed by the Select Board. And we're a legislative body, meaning that we prepare policy documents. We prepared the town plan, and when that was adopted by the Select Board, then we immediately began to prepare a draft of these development regulations, and that's what's before us this evening. Because the Planning Commission's work is policy related, our goal and our focus is on the general welfare of the town as a whole, and we have no particular special interests that would come into play. And before we get started with tonight's presentation, I'd like to introduce the Planning Services Department, our director, Rod Francis. Hello. And our planner, Sue Fillion. And let me turn this now over to Sue Fillion, and she'll talk about the logistics and introduce our planning consultant. Thank you.
So thanks for coming out tonight. I want to let you know that the bathrooms are located right outside this door. Take a right. There's the women's and the men's bathroom. We have snacks in the back, so please feel free to get up. In the crock pot is warm apple cider. And we also have some tea, so feel free to get up during the presentation and help yourself. We're going to ask that you hold your questions till the end of Brandy's presentation. We do have some paper that we can put back there and some pencils, or I can pass them around if you want to jot stuff down as something comes to your mind. And we also have a sign-in sheet, and if you didn't get a chance to sign in, we'll send it around, and please be sure to sign in. If you want to be put on the mailing list so you're notified of any changes to the drafts or any upcoming meetings, please check the marks and we'll make sure to get you on the list. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to Brandy Saxton from PlaceSense. Brandy was hired by the town in April of 2014 to begin work on this project. She's a land use planner with experience in community and regional planning, preparing land use regulations and design guidelines, and GIS mapping and analysis. She has professional certification through the American Institute of Certified Planners and is a member of the American Planning Association and its Northern New England and Upstate New York chapters. Brandy holds a Master's of Public Administration from Syracuse University and a Master of Landscape Architecture from the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. Whew.
The reason why we use the acronyms. So.
Yeah. I didn't know if everybody was going to know the SUNY here. So anyway, thanks, Brandy, for coming out tonight. She's going to walk us through the zoning regulations with particular attention to how it relates to our town plan, and also about the zoning districts and where some of the changes are to the mapped zoning districts. We also have some large-scale maps in the back, and we have some handouts that you might find useful. And there's also a comment box, so please feel free to drop in some comments if you don't want to voice them. We're happy to take them as well. So thank you. Thanks, Brandy.
Well, thank you, everyone, for coming out. I'm going to try to walk through this presentation. Hopefully, it won't be more than 45 minutes. If at all possible, I'd like to try to get through, as Sue said, the presentation sort of in a whole, and then we'll take questions so that we don't get lost down an interesting but perhaps side avenue and not get back and cover everything. There's a lot going on with this proposed zoning revision, and I just want to make sure we do get a broad overview all the way across. A lot of my introductory remarks here regarding this slide, Liz and Sue have covered, but I did just want to point out that this is really a first step in the public outreach effort. The Planning Commission has spent pretty much all of 2014 working on revising the regulations. There's a complete first draft, and I think thinking about it as a first draft is important. If you look through it, you will notice there are points in there that say we need to get feedback on this, we need to come back and think about that. The Planning Commission will be seeking that feedback and input over the next month, roughly, and then going back and making another pass through the regulations and putting together another draft. And then, once there's a final draft, an extensive adoption process begins. So at the very least, the Planning Commission has to have 2 public hearings once they have a complete draft, which probably would be at the beginning, ideally in the March timeframe, some point. And there can be further revisions at that point, more meetings, whatever is needed to get to the point where there's a draft that the Planning Commission is happy with and is ready to move forward to the Select Board. When the draft moves forward to the Select Board, they also have a hearing process and have to have at least 1 hearing. So tonight's meeting is really step 1 on that path, and there's many steps along the way, at which point people can voice their opinions and ask questions and have a real role in directing the outcome and the product that gets produced with these regulations. So it's always good to start with why are we doing this? What is the reason? It's good to have an idea that Brattleboro's regulations have been in place without a comprehensive rewrite since the 80s. And I don't remember which one is which. One was done in the early 80s and one was done in the late 80s between the zoning and the subdivision. And a lot has changed, obviously, over that period of time, from what the town wants to achieve to what's going on in the region in terms of development trends, what we sort of in the planning world think of as good planning practices have changed. There's been case law and state regulations that have changed that influence how the town regulations need to function. And all of these things have resulted in, over time, a bunch of small changes being made to the regulations in that 30-year period. And like anything that you keep tweaking one small little piece at a time, there start to become inconsistencies. The whole, which is supposed to function in an integrated manner, just stops functioning that way. And I think the town plan recognized that Brattleboro's regulations were at that point where that comprehensive review was needed. I believe the plan uses the word cumbersome to describe the current regulations, which is a good sign when you're willing to put the word cumbersome in the town plan that it's time to have this sort of comprehensive review and reconsideration. So what is changing? It's hard to summarize this in obviously one slide. There's some areas of town where not a lot is changing. There's some aspects of the regulations in the current zoning that are working just fine and are going to be continued on through. There's other areas where more is happening and more is changing in certain areas of town, certain aspects. We're going to talk a lot about water-related issues as this slide presentation goes over, and things from stormwater and erosion control and flooding. These are all areas that obviously, due to what has been happening in recent years, have become much higher priorities that the regulations need to address. There's also newer planning ideas that these regulations are trying to pull in from different ways of dealing with plan development, from looking at things that are called form-based code, which really looks at how the physical environment functions and worries less about what the uses are that are going on inside of buildings. A lot of these concepts and ideas that have come out of planning in the last 10 to 15, 20 years are being incorporated into this revision. So the main question, of course, everyone has is how's this going to affect me? And it really depends on where you are in town. There are some areas, like I said, that aren't much affected. The residential and rural districts are changing very little in terms of what's allowed and the lot sizes and things like that, whereas areas along Putney Road and Canal Street, some of those corridors are changing a little bit more, and that's based on what is recommended in the town plan. So this is the draft zoning map. It is up in a big form on the wall in the back, and there's also a map that sort of compares it to what's going on with the zoning districts now. It's a consolidation. The town right now has 19 different adopted zoning districts. This consolidates that to 12 districts. The zoning districts in many places now are based on setbacks from roads. They cut properties in half. In some cases, the district boundary lines run through buildings. We've tried to clean up a lot of that so that the district lines follow lot lines, they follow streams, they follow roads. So there are far fewer properties that are bisected by a zoning district or end up in more than one zoning district. From an administrative point of view, this is a big step towards simplifying the regulations and getting them away from that cumbersome description, making it a lot easier for people to figure out what they can do with their property and what the rules are that apply to it. So there is a table that shows roughly what the transition is from the current districts to what's proposed. That's actually printed on the map at the back as well, because I know it's a little hard to see on the slide. But one thing that should sort of jump out at you from this slide is that there's some that are groups of districts that are being consolidated, whereas there's others that are coming through fairly equivalent to one old district to a new one. For like the downtown, the urban center district is fairly similar in its area and configuration, and is staying. The village center in West Brattleboro the same, whereas some of the commercial office, residential office, those types of districts are being consolidated into a new single district. So the town's land use regulations have to implement the town plan, and as Liz said, the town adopted a new plan in 2013, and since I was not involved with it, I can brag for them that it won the town plan of the year from the Vermont Planners Association. So not only is it a new guiding document, it is a award-winning new guiding document for the town of Brattleboro. And this really sets the stage for what the regulations, this revision to them and where we're headed. So I'm going to walk through some of the recommendations in the town plan, not all of them, because that would take a 2-hour presentation perhaps rather than a 1-hour talk, but I'm just going to hit some of the highlights. There was a lot of really specific guidance in the town plan, and there was a lot of public effort that went into developing the plan and public outreach that sort of built where that policy direction is going. So it's really to see these proposed changes as a continuation of that process. So this is an example, for instance, here. The town plan has a fairly specific recommendation in this case to restrict the permitted uses in industrial areas to industrial uses. And you might say, well, that seems like a really specific thing. Why? This gets back to the idea that industrial land is a limited resource. There's only a limited amount of area that is suitable for those types of uses, places that have truck access, that have enough land that it's suitable to build on, et cetera, and that there's a regional demand and a long-term need for those lands. And if they get developed with things that could go somewhere else, smaller scale commercial things or other types of uses that could go somewhere else, they're not available for that economic development purpose of being accommodating to industry now or in the future. So that's one of the ways the plan is looking for a change, and that's something we have done with this and looked at the industrial district and reduced the non-industrial uses that could go in there. Similarly, it says, hey, look at those light industrial uses. They could go places other than just the industrial district. You know, industry has changed over the last 30 years in terms of, you think about enclosed light manufacturing, high-tech, R&D. These are types of things that are much more similar to office uses than, you know, the brick factory that you might think of when you think of industrial. So that's something to look at, where those light industrial uses could be accommodated in the downtown and surrounding areas and other commercial areas, and that's something that this draft has done. It looked at those uses and it allowed them in more districts. So another area, we'll move off of industry for a moment, a little bit. It said to increase the minimum lot size in the plan in the industrial zone, and that ties back to that idea of having those larger pieces of industrial property for industrial uses, but also in the rural and rural residential district. And the rationale behind that was to protect the natural resources in those rural areas, maintain rural character, things like that. The Planning Commission had been looking at that when I came on board with them in terms of the subdivision, and had said, we agree with that goal, but we think there's a slightly better strategy than just increasing the minimum lot size, and we have continued to work towards that with incorporating the subdivision into the zoning and creating a unified ordinance that says, okay, out in the rural areas, we're not going to base the density on just how much total acreage you have, but on how much is actually developable. So we're not going to consider steep slopes that can't be built on, or riparian areas that are adjacent to wetlands and streams, or surface waters that, that are underwater, areas underwater. So by subtracting those out, we're basing the total acreage, the total density on not the total acreage, but on that developable acreage, so that it has the same result of reducing the development potential in those areas that don't have the land capability to support it. And it also takes into consideration the formula, the road access to these rural areas. And, if land has to be accessed by a class 4 road that can't accommodate heavy traffic or increased traffic and increased residences, so it takes that into account as well. So getting at that same goal of addressing the development capability of rural lands and protecting natural resources and rural character, but from a slightly different direction than just an increase in minimum lot size. Some of the recommendations in the plan are a little broader. Provide design guidance for commercial development. It doesn't really specify all of what should be that design guidance, but sets us in a direction. And this is something that you will see when you do start leafing through Part 2 of the regulations, that many of the districts, particularly in the more developed areas of town, have some design standards that go along with them. And that is a result of this type of language in the plan. They look at what's going on in the frontage of the lot, basically from the edge of the street or sidewalk to the front of the building, and from a design perspective in terms of landscaping and signage, what the building facades look like in terms of the scale of the building, massing, windows, entrances, porches, roof lines. Is there something of interest going on with these buildings, or are they simple little basic boxes? And also looks at parking, which is a big aspect of design, particularly for commercial development. And, so there's some standards in those districts that relate to parking as well. A recommendation to reduce the amount of impervious surfaces in commercial areas. This is a common part of a common theme that runs through the town plan and runs through this revision to the regulations, all of which goes back to stormwater, erosion, flooding related issues, sort of they're interlinked 3 issues. An impervious surface that's paved, roofed, stuff the water can't go through, generating stormwater runoff that ends up exacerbating flooding downstream. So that is a change that is in the draft regulations. The commercial district today allows for 90% lot coverage, so you could basically pave over 90% and only have 10% green space. This recommends in the equivalent service center zoning district, which would be a new proposed zoning district, reducing that to 60% from 90%. It's a big change, but it reflects sort of the new approach to trying to deal with more stormwater on site, and you need some green space to make that happen. The town plan referenced the requirement you have now that there be an economic development study for a large-scale development. After much discussion, the Planning Commission has come to the conclusion that this is something whose time has passed. It's really no longer a relevant concern for a couple of reasons. This is something that can be removed from the zoning. Development trends and market conditions have changed. There's not the same demand to build that big box type of development as there was 10, 15, 20 years ago. We've changed the zoning areas with this proposed revision, leaving a much smaller area that could accommodate these type of buildings, so you don't have to worry about them showing up in many places in town. It's a fairly discrete area. that's already appropriately developed with compatible type buildings where that type of development could go. And so this is really a provision in the current zoning that's addressing a concern that isn't really as large of an issue as it was when it was adopted in. The town plan also recommends creating a historic district in the downtown area and thinking about historic resource protection in general. The town has several National Register historic districts. The proposed draft calls for doing a more design review in those areas through an overlay district. And this is an area that the Planning Commission in particular is looking for feedback from people on, particularly if you are located in one of the National Register districts. This would be a new and different thing for Brattleboro to do. Haven't done that in the past. You have design guidelines for West Brattleboro and the downtown that have been used in the development review process, but this would really formalize that a little bit more and require potentially more things within those targeted historic districts to come in through the development review board process. So this is an area that we're definitely interested to talk to the people who are in these property owners and residents in these areas and get feedback on. Coming back around to the water issues that run throughout this, looking at natural resource protection. There's a lot of specific recommendations in the plan in this area. Riparian buffers. This is probably one of the more significant changes with this proposed draft regulations from current practice. And it looks at creating essentially a 100-foot riparian area along all the streams and wetlands that are mapped in town. There's actually a map on the back wall here that shows what that area would encompass and how it's a change from your current zoning, which has some level of buffering and shoreland area regulations, is that it goes up into the small streams and into the tributaries, with the idea that that's where the stormwater can most easily be kept and held and controlled. That if you wait until you get down to the big streams down at the bottom of the hill, you've really missed an opportunity to attenuate more of that flooding. So that is the principle that goes beyond that, trying to keep more of that area in sort of woody natural vegetation. The zoning districts, depending on which one, have different types of setbacks that structures and development would have to stay out of. And then that 100-foot area becomes an area where conditional use review is going to be required for a lot of development. So at least it's being looked at by the Development Review Board a little higher level than just having to come in for a zoning permit to see what's going on in those corridors close to the streams. There's also language in here that relates to steep slopes, and that is also tied right into the same set of water issues. The steeper the slope, the more water that comes off it, the faster it comes off it. It's particularly if you start clearing the trees and disturbing the soil, the natural soil that's there. And so this draft regulation addresses those steep slope areas and sets some thresholds so that if you're disturbing over a certain amount of area on a steep slope, that would also trigger a conditional use review and creates some sort of maximum amounts of disturbance that can be done on those extremely steep slopes. And there's also language, another big place that changes are being made relates to planned unit developments. There's a lot of discussion in the town plan about the town's current planned unit development provisions, which seem to have irritated people on all sides of the table over the time, because they require, it's a pretty intensive administrative process. It basically requires a zoning map amendment every time someone wants to do a PUD, which is our planner speak for planned unit development, which is a way to sort of look at doing development on a coordinated manner on a whole piece of property. It might be a mix of uses and multiple buildings all on a single piece of property. And we're basically coming up with an entirely new approach to doing PUDs, administratively making it simpler, just going through a development review board process, very similar to a subdivision review process, and setting up a framework within which these PUDs would work. For instance, in the rural areas, there's a conservation subdivision type of PUD, and that would basically be the type of PUD that you would do if you wanted to do a residential cluster. where you have conserved open space and you group the homes on the most appropriate portions of the property. And that is a change from the current zoning, but it was where the town was headed with the subdivision regulations, and some of you may have been familiar with the discussions or involved in the discussions around the subdivision regulations last spring, and so that basically is a continuation from where that process left off. So flooding and erosion, the town plan calls for a reduction, and I think that's a big, broad policy statement, but I just wanted to have this opportunity to bring that slide in because it's really, there's a real reason for all of these water-related issues, and we only need to look at these photos to be reminded of what that is. So the riparian zones I already talked about, the erosion control and stormwater management pieces in the regulations have been beefed up, I guess I would describe them, from what you currently have. There's sort of a gap right now in the regulatory system. Big projects get state permits, and these are generally things that disturb an acre or a land or something, but there's a lot of sort of moderate scale projects that cumulatively have big effects that don't necessarily need permits, and this is what the regulations in the town zoning are focused on, those mid-range scale projects that don't need a state permit, but still cumulatively are adding to the stormwater and flooding problems. Once again, a broad policy idea to increase public access to the waterfront. The proposed zoning incorporates a new zoning district, a water and recreation district, which includes areas along the Connecticut, along the Whetstone, along the West River, and some other recreation areas and the public water supply reservoir area as well. And it emphasizes the idea of trying to use the water frontage as an amenity, as a resource, taking advantage of it. Recreation uses are broadly encouraged in this area. Other uses are allowed as well. But really, by creating this district and calling out that this waterfront is something of value, is sort of just changing the way we've dealt historically with development turning its back to the water and facing away, which you only have to look at downtown here to see that that has been the traditional pattern. And this tries to say, let's look at that frontage as the asset that it is and work with it. So I already mentioned the PUD component a little bit. And like I said, the current process is quite outdated, out of step with state practices. The way Brattleboro does PUD approvals and process is very different than the way most Vermont towns do it. So that is the idea, is to make this process far less cumbersome again for applicants. Another recommendation of the town plan, reduce the number of zoning districts along Putney Road. There are 9 now. And we have got it down to 3. So we've considered this a good corridor success story here, and something that will be a little more cohesive. And those 9 districts are really the response of, over time, efforts being made to address some particular issue that came up, some particular issue that came up, some particular issue that came up, whether it was a result of a planning study or a proposed development or whatever, over that 30-year period. And so this, just leads to the whole frontage along the road getting chopped up district to district to district and administratively making it difficult. So there are now these 3 zones that we're actually going to be looking at a little bit more detail in the walking tour that we're going to be going on in the later part of the presentation. So the town plan also calls for support of infill residential development, and there's a lot of actions have been taken in the draft to work towards this. Housing is now allowed in most of the commercial zoning districts. Really, the only place that housing isn't allowed is in the industrial district. And in fact, we've created a new neighborhood center district. That's the whole idea behind it, is this mix of commercial and higher density housing. We'll be talking about that a little later on in the presentation as well. Also bringing more residential into the traditionally commercial areas, so the service center district area, and looking at the possibility of bringing housing in there as well. And then within the residential neighborhoods, currently you have two sort of residential districts, a residential and a residential multiple district, or multiple residential. I can't remember which way it goes. And yeah, those have been consolidated into one district, and many of the individual PUDs, as I said before, to get a PUD you used to have to do a zoning map amendment, so there's many little individual zoning districts that are approved PUDs that are various types of housing development, subdivisions, etc. So those have all been consolidated into a single residential district, which allows for a range of different housing types, from single-family homes through multifamily living. So we're going to transition over to the walking tour, and this being January, we're not actually going to have to go out and walk, although I have made people do this in the past. The real reason that we're not out there is not because it's cold, but because it's dark, and so it's next to impossible to do a good walking tour in the dark. So we're going to begin with this virtual walking tour on the Putney Street corridor. We're going to start from the southern end, from Veterans Bridge, and we're going to proceed north to the overpass and look at this transition now going through these three districts. Like I said, we've taken this roadway corridor, which there's the road running through there, and done 3 districts from 9. Oh, that's nice. That makes my computer beep. We have the neighborhood center, and in the middle in the pink we have the service center, and then up above the industrial in the purple. So those 3 zones. So here we are at the bridge. Thankfully we can now use Google Street View to see where we are, and we don't have to actually go out there in the cold. So we're going to start, like I said, at the bridge. It's in the neighborhood commercial district all the way up to Technology Drive. And the goal of this area is really to encourage infill housing, which obviously relates back to one of the previous slides, and to create a more sort of pedestrian-friendly oriented village area here. Now that's quite different than what's on the ground now, but the idea is to think of the West Brattleboro Village Center as a model of that type of traditional village that has a mix of housing and commercial development. You think about bringing that scale and pattern of development to this area over time. Obviously, it's not going to happen instantaneously upon adoption of these regulations, but moving in that direction incrementally over time. Small to mid-sized businesses, much more community-oriented, not relying on attracting lots of cars off the interstate to come to them. So it addresses concerns about traffic congestion, and a mix of housing, different types that will be good for maintaining a diverse population over time.
There is already housing in that district, isn't
There
there?
is housing in this district. There really isn't. There's some higher density housing up on the hill, and then there's commercial down by the road. It really isn't integrated at this point. The idea would be to try to integrate it a little more over time. So the slide sort of talks about some of the basic standards for this district, and if you do pick up the booklet handout that's in the back, these are laid out in more detail in there. But encouraging mixed use, thinking about bringing the buildings closer to the road, 10 to 40 feet setback from the edge of this road, maintaining some landscape green space along the street, keeping the amount of parking that's between the edge of the street and the front of the building to a minimum. There's some opportunity for some parking, recognizing that the type of businesses that go in here are probably going to want to have some front parking, but not making it an asphalt-dominated streetscape. Keeping the scale of the buildings to some sort of mid-range. We've got 12,000 square feet. This is a number that we're looking for feedback on as well in terms of what people think is a reasonable sized building in these areas. 24 feet minimum height, and then a 4-foot maximum height. The idea behind having this minimum height is to prevent that sort of low squat box building, requiring a little bit more in terms of facade and roof line and things like that to get to a 24-foot height, even with a single story.
What was the maximum on that?
4 stories.
Or, yes. Right.
I'm sorry, I'm hoping my voice makes it all the way through these 3 days. So we're going to switch over to a video clip. Well, you don't have to go on a walking tour. Sue and I did. And despite the fact that we tried 3 days to do this, we never did get a sunny day. It is January, after all. And so it is a bit dreary to look at, but we hope that at least it illustrates the principles that I just talked about. We're actually going to look at a piece of the corridor that is further north. We're going to look going up by the Stakeout restaurant. While this is not in the neighborhood center district, it actually encapsulates many of the goals that we would be trying to achieve in the neighborhood center district. Oop, nope, I have a slide first. I guess I'm out of order. Well, in any event, we'll get to the video in a minute. So these illustrations, which are in the zoning district language in part 2 of the regulations, are also meant to sort of illustrate the basic principles that we're trying to achieve. A wide variety of building types are possible within this neighborhood center district. Pedestrian-friendly street frontages, so sidewalks are a big issue in these areas because sidewalks are incomplete in some of the places where this district would be located. Breaking up the building masses and having interesting roof lines and things like that. Thinking about shared parking and access. Once again, that goes back to the traffic congestion on Putney Road and trying to address that and make things work more smoothly. Now we're ready for the video.
Are these buildings going to be, like these residential and commercial buildings in these areas, going to be held to some kind of...
Walking north on Putney Road towards the Stakeout restaurant. This is an example of development that would be encouraged and appropriate in either the proposed neighborhood center or service center districts. The building is set back about 40 feet from the street. There is a nicely landscaped 20-foot green space in front, and there is landscaping within the parking lot as well. The parking is located entirely to the side and rear of the building. It is accessed from a shared drive that also serves another building behind this one. While there is no sidewalk along this part of Putney Road, this site otherwise meets most of the proposed standards with a well-designed layout and 2-story building with interesting architectural elements.
So with regard to the question about the design standards, these would generally apply, the design standards that I've spoken of a couple of times in the slides, would generally apply to things that have to come in for site plan review. So that includes commercial things, mixed-use projects, and multifamily development. It does not include single and 2-family homes. So when we're speaking about design standards, we're generally speaking about commercial, mixed-use, multifamily things. Does that answer your question?
I was thinking, like, aesthetically, are they going to be held to some standard aesthetically for their zone?
The standards, we're calling them design standards, and there are standards related to building, but we're not telling you it has to be one of 3 shades of white with green shutters and things like that. So the design standards are more based on the form and massing of the building, the placement of the building in relation to the street and the parking, those types of components of the building, not down to you have to be a certain architectural style or a certain color or things like that. So that's not the type of design review we're talking about. Get a little more of the fundamental building blocks of the buildings themselves. So moving north, we're going to move into the service center district north of Technology Drive, and this continues up to the roundabout. Once we get north of the roundabout, the service center district is on the west side, and the industrial district is on the right side. On the east side, I have such trouble with east, west, right, and left. I always have to mentally think them through. So if you saw the map, you saw where it was pink on one side and purple on the other. So that's your service center on one side of the road and industrial on the other. So the goal here is to accommodate traveler services. That's obviously a main role that's function that's already occurring here, things like hotels and restaurants that serve people who are traveling through, and regional scale businesses as well. So that gets to your, grocery store and some of your larger retail things. These are the areas that are nearer to the exit. They have that better access. It's a highway commercial type of use, but we're trying to make it a little more walkable, bikeable, and creating an attractive gateway to the town. So we're coming at it from that perspective in terms of the design. So larger scale retail allowed, buildings set back somewhere 20 to 100 feet from the road, edge of the road, with about 20 feet of green space in front along the street. We already talked about the lot coverage. I see that says 12 rows of parking between the building and max. It's 2. My typing got out of hand there. So 2 rows of parking, and that lines up with that 20 to 100 feet. So that's, if you have the 2 rows of parking and the 20 feet of green space, you end up with a building that's somewhere 80 or 90 feet back with, by the time you add up all that space. So functionally that all works together. Again, the 24-foot minimum height and 4-story max.
Do the bike lanes for future proposal, does that fall into the zoning plan?
The existing bike lanes are in the state highway right-of-way, so they are outside the scope of the zoning. There is a little bit in the zoning that talks about places that are anticipating being heavily bike-oriented or attracting bikes, and providing places for people to park their bikes, so providing bike racks and just making sure that there is a safe way to get into these properties that not only deals with bicyclists but also pedestrians. So while this is an auto-oriented area and is probably going to remain it should still be a safe place to walk and bike as well.
It seems kind of crucial to tie what you're trying to do for the downtown to the new area of Putney Road together.
And I think that is very consistent with what this is trying to do. So this shows some of those design standards applied. Trying to do more shared parking and shared access is important. That frontage along the street, more landscaping. This gets both to the aesthetics and the attractive gateway component, the pedestrian friendliness component, and to some of the stormwater component. These landscaped areas can do double duty and also help with stormwater retention and infiltration. Trying to get more of the parking to the side and rear of buildings, so there can be some in the front, but most of it would be to the side or the rear. And trying to encourage more interesting architecture than just the simple box. Thinking about the building facades, whether it's awnings or some outdoor seating areas, even in these highway-oriented commercial areas, those can still be nice amenities that make it seem like it's a attractive place you want to stop and enjoy. And so we look here at different ways to achieve this. The buildings can be interior, very conventional retail and commercial environments, but have on their exterior some more interesting architecture through a little bit a more creative design. And then we come to another video clip here. So in this one, we're going to be walking past the Aldi on Putney Road. This all is not in the service center district, it's actually in the neighborhood commercial, but it's a good example of the dimensional standards I spoke about being in the service center district. It fits that pretty closely.
Here we are walking south along Putney Road past the Aldi. This is an example of the form of development that would meet the requirements for the proposed service center district. The building is set back 90 feet, which is within the range of 20 to 100 feet that would be required. It has landscaped green space between the street and the parking lot of about 20 feet, which is what would be required under the new service center district. And it has 2 rows of parking in front of the building, which is the maximum allowed in the proposed district.
So it's funny to keep talking about all this green space, and it's actually white space at this time of year. Should go through and change all those, green or white space. And we have another clip to look at, and this is going to be walking from the McDonald's in that corridor. And what's interesting about this is that there's several buildings here with different approaches to their frontages. So it's a good comparison of different dimensions and setbacks, so you can get some sense of what these numbers look like in the real world.
Walking south on Putney Road past the McDonald's. The McDonald's is set back about 120 feet, which is further than would be allowed under the proposed service center district. There is one row of parking in front and 36 feet of green space between the street and front of the building. There is no sidewalk. As we approach the Kentucky Fried Chicken, the sidewalk does begin on the other side of their entrance drive. That building is set back about 60 feet from the street, and there's one row of parking in front. There is no landscaping there or green space between the street and the building, however. The office building further south, that is set back about 80 feet. There's no parking in front of the building at all, so that's all landscaped yard. There is a shared entrance to that building that goes back to parking in the back that's also shared by multiple buildings in the rear. This building is very typical of what would be encouraged in the neighborhood center district as well. If it was in the neighborhood center, the idea would be to bring it closer to the road so that it wasn't set back more than 40 feet, but it's two-story and has a pedestrian-oriented entrance and windows.
Okay. So with that, we're actually going to transition from Putney Road to Canal Street and look at that segment of the corridor here. So we're going to begin looking along Canal Street. We're basically starting from the downtown and proceeding south. There are 6 districts along this corridor transitioning through here. When we start all the way up, the map cuts off, all the way up at the very top, is urban center downtown. And then we come into a mixed-use corridor interspersed with residential. When we get to the hospital, that's this gray block here in the center. That's an institutional district for the hospital and the other facilities across the road. And then it transitions back through the mixed use to the neighborhood center, some more mixed use, some service center. So this is still a corridor that has quite a few zoning districts running through it. This is still less zoning districts than there are today. It's not quite the simplest 3 that we got to on Putney Road, but this is a fairly complex corridor in terms of what's already there on the ground. So one of the things we did try to do was reflect a little more what's there today in this corridor, as well as where we want it to go in the future. So here we are at the beginning of the Canal Street corridor from the downtown. And what I wanted to point out with this first photo, and this is something that we're going to be going into in greater detail at the meeting on the evening of February 5, where we're going to talk about the downtown and the immediate adjacent areas there, is this idea of that distinction between the urban center and the mixed use or residential neighborhoods that abut it. And I think this top photo is an excellent example. It's an actual physical transition. There is a difference. And you can see that. There's a difference in the type of building, and that's the distinction. The urban center is primarily block commercial type buildings. When we move into the mixed use or residential neighborhoods, we have detached homes and other smaller buildings. And I think that first photo really illustrates that, and the second one as well, where we go from the co-op to the house that's immediately adjacent to it. There's a real distinction and difference between the built environment in these 2 places. So as we travel southward, we are moving from the co-op towards Elm Street. This is a mixed-use proposed district. The goal here is to maintain a residential scale and character to the built environment, but be more flexible in terms of the uses. Recognizing that there's already a mix of businesses in these areas, that it's an area that does transition. There's some places where there's still fairly solid residential. There's some places where there's combination of commercial and residential in the same buildings, and there's some areas where there are standalone commercial buildings. So this district isn't meant to accommodate these areas, and think about, as long as we're preserving that neighborhood scale and character, being a little more flexible in how the buildings can be used. And this is sort of an illustration of the design components that we're looking at. These are really meant to be very pedestrian oriented, bringing the buildings up pretty close to the road, keeping that frontage with, if it's going to be commercial, think about display windows, that type of thing that are interesting on the street. Trying to do more shared parking and limiting the access points on the road. Once again, getting back to trying to better manage traffic and avoid congestion. So these are all the sort of design goals for this area. As we continue south from Elm Street towards Frost Place, it's primarily residential. Home businesses, some small-scale businesses are allowed within the residential district, but it's primarily residential. The goal being, once again, to maintain the traditional pattern, so buildings 15 to 40 feet from the road, that's pretty typical of the neighborhood. Maintaining some green space along the street, or establishing it potentially in the future where it might not exist. Generally no parking in that front area, keeping the parking to the side or the rear. Keeping the overall scale of the buildings within the range of residential buildings, so that new structures don't dwarf the existing buildings that are there. 3-story maximum height here. So the residential neighborhood, because it does cover, as we saw on the first map, all those areas that were yellow, it covers a lot of different types of residential neighborhoods all around the town. So it's very accommodating of different forms of housing. And so there's lots of different opportunities for housing, from attached and multifamily down to single-family cottages and mobile homes. All of these types of housing are possible in these neighborhoods. So as we continue along Canal Street from Frost Place towards Burge Street, it's once again becoming more diverse. So there's some, as I was saying, there's some clusters that are more residential, some that have more mixed use. So the mixed use and residential districts sort of go back and forth along different sides of the road. And when you look at the map in detail, you can see that at some points, it's residential and mixed use, and then it moves and flips. So it's a bit complicated to explain verbally, but when you look at the map, you can see how it fits together. So as we continue on past Burge Street, here, let's see, I've lost my slides. It becomes mixed use on both sides of the road. We've transitioned out of the more strictly residential into the more mixed area. And then we encounter another sort of clump of residential neighborhood, and it recognizes that south of Marshall Street. So then we come to a video of looking at sort of the mixed use characteristics along Canal Street.
Heading south on Canal Street towards the Burge Street intersection. Along this segment of Canal Street, there would be different zoning districts on each side of the road. The east side, your left, would be in the residential neighborhood district, while the west side, your right, would be in the mixed-use district. Currently, the west side is zoned commercial. The town plan recommends eliminating the commercial district along this segment of Canal Street. The proposed mixed-use district that would replace it would still provide opportunity for some businesses to locate in this area, like professional offices and small neighborhood shops. It would require that there be at least one dwelling on any lot with a new business in the future. The goal of this change is to maintain a neighborhood quality in this area, since there are many homes along this part of Canal Street, and avoid it becoming more of a highway commercial corridor, which would lead to increased traffic congestion and conflict between commercial and residential uses. South of Burge Street intersection, both sides of Canal Street would be in the mixed-use district.
So we are approaching the hospital on Canal Street, and there's a new district being proposed, an institutional district. This relates back to the PUDs, believe it or not. Because the town has these individual PUDs, many of the institutions, such as the hospital, school, the retreat, various institutions around town are in their own little individual PUD districts. So those are all going to be consolidated under this draft into a new institutional district, and so one of those would be here for the hospital area. There's a lot of flexibility in this district in terms of the dimensional standards, and allowing for the types of uses that are found in these areas, you know, educational facilities, healthcare facilities, offices, residential, etc. And the basic requirement is that over time, many of them already have a master plan, and those that don't, as they change and develop over time, would go through a master planning process, and then development could proceed in accordance with those master plans. So as we get south of the hospital, we have another short section of mixed use neighborhood, and comes into being the neighborhood commercial district where the Brattleboro Pharmacy and the House of Pizza are. So right in there is where that district changes. We move to the neighborhood center, where just like we looked at up on Putney Road, would be a little more commercial, but still allowing for that mix of residential in there as well. And this neighborhood center district continues south through the Price Chopper Plaza and to the Walgreens. As we get south of Fairground Road and past the Walgreens, south of Fairground Road, there's a small area of mixed use. There's sort of an existing neighborhood there around Generous Street. So this is a bit of a buffer, and that's one way to also think about these mixed-use districts along these corridors, is that they are an area of buffering and transition for the neighborhoods that are behind them. So those side streets that come off of Canal Street have, you know, nice residential neighborhoods that continue off behind them. As there's more commercial development and traffic, that could start to intrude on those neighborhoods. So these mixed-use districts also serve that purpose of scaling it down a little bit so that it's an appropriate transition to the neighborhood that's behind it. And then we have another video here. This will be walking up and past towards the Brattleboro Pharmacy. This really looks at the aspects of the buildings in that area that fit in with the neighborhood center standards.
Walking north on Canal Street towards the House of Pizza and Brattleboro Pharmacy. Both of these sites incorporate many of the design standards that would be required in the proposed neighborhood center and mixed-use districts. The buildings are placed close to the street with 10 to 15 feet of green space between the front of the building and the edge of the sidewalk. Both the proposed neighborhood center and mixed-use districts would require buildings to be set back 10 to 40 feet from the street with at least 10 feet of landscaped green space in front. The shared parking is located to the side between the buildings and is accessed from a common drive. There is no parking in front of either building. The building facades incorporate architectural elements like porches and display windows. The Brattleboro Pharmacy building, with its traditional two-story architectural form, is a particularly good example of the type of development that would be encouraged in the proposed neighborhood center district and in the proposed mixed-use district with an apartment upstairs.
And then we get a second video coming where we're going to be walking past the Walgreens and looking at that frontage.
Walking north on Canal Street past the Walgreens. This building is set back about 50 feet from the street, which is within the range of 20 to 100 feet that would be allowed within the proposed service center district, but more than the 40 feet maximum that would be allowed within the neighborhood center district. There is a 15-foot wide, well-landscaped green space with a decorative fence along the sidewalk. The proposed regulations call for a 10-foot green space in the neighborhood center and a 20-foot green space in the service center districts. There is a marked pedestrian walkway from the sidewalk to the building entrance. On the Putney Road side, there is no parking in front of the building, while on the Fairground Road side there is. Under the proposed regulations, there could only be 10 parking spaces between the building and street in the neighborhood center district, and 2 rows of parking between the building and street in the service center district.
So that is not traffic noise on Canal Street, that's traffic noise on my street. Where log trucks come by my house quite regularly.
It's like being in downtown Brattleboro.
Yeah. Yes. Just about every truck that brings logs to the Ticonderoga paper mill in New York passes by my house. It's lovely. So we're going to transition over to looking at Elliott Frost and Bird Street area. This is an area where the proposed zoning is making a fairly big change from current zoning, and we'll actually be looking at this area in greater detail at the February 5th meeting as well, as we talk about the downtown and the immediately adjacent neighborhoods. So the idea would be to make the areas that come off around Elliott, Frost, and Bird Streets part of the mixed-use district. They currently are, obviously, very mixed-use areas. And we just have a short video here to look at some of those aspects. We're not going to dwell in as great a detail on the standards because we've already done that for the mixed use. But here we are on Frost Street.
Walking east towards downtown on Frost Street. This is a historically mixed-use neighborhood, and the current land use remains very diverse. The goal of the draft regulations is to create opportunities for new mixed-use neighborhoods in these areas close to downtown. Such development might include a variety of housing, offices, commercial, and light industrial uses that do not generate heavy traffic and are compatible with nearby residences. The new Cultural Intrigue facility is a good example of a new use and building fitting into this neighborhood and meeting many of the proposed design standards in the draft regulations. This area would be rezoned from several different zoning districts into the new proposed mixed-use district. The proposed planned unit development PUD provisions in the draft regulations would provide even more flexibility for creative redevelopment in this area.
So sorry that one is so blurry. We were actually losing our light. The camera was having incredible difficulties focusing. It's the last clip we took. We had to give it up. My fingers were going to freeze off and the camera wouldn't focus anymore. The fun of the walking tour was over. So we did look up in West Brattleboro Village as well. We don't want to not mention West Brattleboro during this presentation. A lot of the more significant zoning changes are occurring elsewhere in town. So West Brattleboro is staying a lot like it currently is with this village center district and fairly similar standards in terms of the dimensions and the uses. The idea really being that West Brattleboro Village's historic development pattern is good. We should keep it. And the new regulations match that historic pattern. But I think, as I mentioned before, the neighborhood center district is somewhat patterned on that form of development. So looking at some of the things that are here in West Brattleboro is also a good way to think about what, over time, those neighborhood center areas could become.
In West Brattleboro Village, walking east on Western Avenue. The draft regulations propose little change to the current zoning in West Brattleboro Village. The goal is to encourage a mix of uses, protect the historic character of the village, and ensure that new development is compatible with the traditional forms and patterns of development. Buildings would have to be at least 2 stories. Buildings would have to be located close to the street with a setback between 10 and 40 feet. A building cannot have a footprint of more than 6,000 square feet, so new construction will remain in scale with historic buildings. Parking would have to be located to the side or rear of buildings. Building entrances would be oriented to the street and sidewalk. Signs would be appropriately scaled to pedestrians and lower speed traffic. Sidewalks, landscaping, shallow building setbacks, and architectural elements like porches and display windows, would all contribute to creating a pedestrian-friendly village setting. All of these requirements simply codify the traditional development patterns and practices that historically were and remain characteristic of the village.
Okay, and that is the end of the walking tour and of my presentation. So we're going to open it up to questions and comments. Okay, I'll start in the back and then I'll move up to you.
You mentioned the 12,000 square foot max for the neighborhood center district. Can you give an example of a building in town that's about 12,000 square feet?
Do you know, Sue, off the top? Trying to think of one.
Right, a 12,000 square foot building in town.
We should have looked one up, I guess.
We had this written down at some point.
12,000 square foot building where?
A 12,000 square foot building.
An example of one.
Example of one.
In Brattleboro, do you know of one?
Single story?
Doesn't matter. So-
The building that you showed on Putney Road next to McDonald's, that's probably a little bit under.
Yeah, I think that one's
The office
under.
building.
If you take both walls.
Yeah, Road Cellar.
Yeah.
The office building we looked at that's next to Kentucky Fried Chicken and Taco Bell. It's probably a little under.
I think, if I'm remembering correctly, I measured off the Aldi. I think that one was 16,000 square feet.
I think so.
So
Yes.
if you think about, that being another 4,000 on top,
Yeah, advanced auto parts actually would be
pretty close.
Or, yeah. It's a bit smaller than all these.
And if you're at all familiar with your standard dollar store, usually those are somewhere in that 10 to 12,000 square foot range as well.
Walgreens,
Yeah,
they're bigger than
the
Walgreens.
Yeah. So, you had a question?
Yeah, what would be the trigger for compliance and renovation?
So many of the components trigger at the point of site plan review, and I do actually have a more detailed list here. Let me see which. This one. It varies based on the aspects, which aspect of the standards you're looking at. So let me find the right slide here. Tomorrow morning's presentation is getting into the nuts and bolts of the standards a little bit more, so I'm cheating here and going ahead to that one. So say the standards related to parking. Those would trigger at the point at which a project would come in for site plan review, but only to the maximum extent that's feasible given what you got to work with. So you don't have to 100% comply. If you can't get the parking out of that front area because there's no place else to put it, it can stay there. But there's sort of another statement that says our highest priority is to try to get it out of that front setback. So if you can reconfigure, or if you don't need as much, one of the things that is happening is that less parking is being required for many things. So it actually may be possible to eliminate some parking in some of these areas where before more parking was required. So that's one possibility. Stormwater is one that, because of all the issues surrounding stormwater, trying to retrofit that is a higher priority item. So many more development projects would have to address stormwater retrofit to the best that they can, given we have to be realistic about what's on the ground and what you can do to fix it. So there's flexibility in there, but the idea, is, particularly with the stormwater, is to try to make improvements where we can. Things like signs have to come into conformance either when the content, if you had a non-conforming sign, when the content, the primary message of the sign changes, or if the building is being substantially renovated and significant facade work is being done, then the signs have to be brought up at that point. On the other hand, outdoor lighting, if you're going to be modifying the outdoor lighting, then all the lighting needs to be brought into conformance, because modifying the lighting isn't quite as high a bar as, say, pulling out a whole bunch of parking and things like that. So it varies based on the standards. If you look at the draft, you look at Part 3 of the regulations and look at the various components. Each of them sort of have an applicability section in them, and they either have a section that's labeled nonconformities or is labeled previously developed sites, and that explains how what would trigger different levels of review and what has to conform to these standards and when redevelopment, because obviously a lot of projects in Brattleboro are going to be redevelopment projects. So yeah. Here, and then I'll go here.
On Canal Street, Lower Canal Street, there's a historic neighborhood, and that's in the mixed use. How does that mesh with the mixed use and the things that go along with keeping it a historic neighborhood?
And that's, if I'm correct, Sue, is one of the National Register districts, right? That's the
Yeah, are you
Yes.
saying Clark Canal or Horton Homestead?
Clark
Or the other
Canal.
one?
Yeah,
Clark,
Clark
okay.
Canal.
So what would happen in that case if the proposal goes forward with this draft historic district overlay, when a contributing building in that historic district, if there were going to be exterior modifications, people who are in the historic preservation world or have done historic preservation have heard of the Department of Interior, Secretary of Interior standards for historic, rehabilitations and such. So those would be the guiding documents. You'd have to implement the recommendations of those guidance documents, and they actually now have, instead of just those 10 or so broad statements about maintaining, historic integrity and things like that, they actually have some on-the-ground guidance documents now that are much more like, okay, you have a building that's got brick in it. These are the things you should do. These are the things you shouldn't do. You've got a slate roof. These are the things you should do. These are the things you shouldn't do. And so the design review aspect of the overlay district would look at those. Are you implementing appropriate standards based on those guidelines? So while the use might change in those buildings, the idea would be to try to maintain the historic character of the buildings.
It would be like, they could be used for businesses, like doctor's offices or
Yep.
something like that.
Yeah, yeah. And yes.
Apart from the amount of parking between a building and the road, can you share a little bit of the philosophy of why there seems to be a desire to have the buildings so close to the roads? Like, for example, you were talking about that office building on Putney Road, and you said that I think you said that there was more green space between the building and the road than would be appropriate for the future. And I wondered why that isn't recommended.
Where the building sits, it actually does fit the proposed standard, but if that building was moved to one of the proposed neighborhood center areas, that's where the idea would be to bring the building closer to the road in those areas. And it's two items. It's matching sort of the historic pattern. You'll find that range of 10 to 40 feet is pretty typical for historic neighborhoods in terms of where the buildings sat. And also from a pedestrian-friendly and oriented point of view. Well, actually, and there's a third thing that happens, too, because we want to try to get the parking to the side of the rear. And so one of the best ways to do that is to bring the building closer so you have more room for the parking. If you push the building way back and we say we want the parking way back, there isn't enough room for all of this to go on these properties. So those aspects all sort of work together. And, from a pedestrian's point of view, as you're walking down the street, having that interest with buildings fairly close to the street, if we want in the neighborhood center, if we're thinking that these are going to be places that people may be able to walk to, walking into a building that's 40 foot back from the street is different than walking into a building that's 80 feet or 100 feet back from a building. There's a reason that most of us drive to shopping plazas and get our car as close to the door as possible because they're not great places to be walking through as a pedestrian. So those aspects are kind of interrelated. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Other questions? Well, if there aren't other questions, I would recommend that people get themselves a warm beverage for the road to enjoy. We have materials on the back table and the maps up on the wall, and myself and Rod and Sue will be circulating around. You can certainly come up and talk to us about any other questions or issues you have. And thank you all for coming out.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.